whilst people are tuning in, I do want to start, of course, by acknowledging that we're meeting here on Ngunnawal and Ngambri lands, and want to acknowledge the first Australians of these lands where we're meeting here, and of course various of you are joining from all over the country, and to pay respects to elders past, present, and to any Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander colleagues that are joining us online. Really a very, very important year for the first Australians, a very important voice referendum taking place this year, and we fully support that. So I'm Sharon Friel. Welcome to Saving the World webinar series. We aim high. We'll have it all sorted by the end of the year. And as you know, the webinar series comes as part of an ARC Laureate Fellowship that we have here in the School of Regulation and Global Governance. The Laureate focuses on governance for planetary health equity. And each month, I'm joined with one of the Laureate Fellows. Today, it's Megan Arthur, but you'll notice she's not in the room. Megan has hurt her back, and she's there online, and she will join us when we get towards the end of the session. But of course, we're always joined by a marvellous colleague to really think big, help us pay attention to some of the big structural issues that are part of what we've been referring to as the consumptogenic system, the web of actors, of institutions, of policies, of commercial activities, of norms that really incentivize and reward the excessive production and consumption of fossil fuel goods and services, which are often very, very bad for human health and very unequally distributed. And of course, fundamental to this issue is the economic paradigm in which we are currently living, particularly in high-income countries. And I am so pleased to be joined on this webinar by our wonderful our wonderful Hothouse thinker in residence, Dr. Katherine Trebeck. Many of you, I'm sure, will already know Katherine's work has been really one of the leaders in the Wellbeing Economy globally, co-founder of the Wellbeing Economy Alliance. If you have not read her book, and this is a shameless plug for Katherine's book, The Economics of Arrival, please go out and get it today and read it. It is so accessible and so important for the sorts of issues that we really are having to grapple with in society today if we are going to do anything about social equity, environmental sustainability, and of course for us in the Hothouse, how all of that's connected to health and well-being. So with no further ado, I am going to hand over to Katherine. She's going to speak for about 30-ish.
Yeah, maybe less.
Yeah,
I hope less.
However long.
Famous last words.
So just give me a little second and I'll get to your slides.
So while you're doing that, Sharon, thank you so much, and thanks very much to the wonderful team at the Planetary Health Hothouse. It's delightful to be part of this incredible team and to be given this opportunity to have a chat with you and Megan. And Megan, sorry you're not in the room. I hope you're back. It's better soon. What I thought I'd do is just a bit of a canter through some of the key ideas inherent to a wellbeing economy. A couple of examples of the sort of policies and actions that we could expect as we move towards building a wellbeing economy. But what I really want to do is keep that fairly top level. So it'll be sort of a race through the big picture, and then with the hope that I will leave enough time at the end, famous last words I know, but I intend to leave enough time at the end so that we can have a discussion. You can dive into the particular areas that you'd really like to know more of. But I want to start with a couple of images that, get this arrow where it needs to be. Oh, up and down. I want to start with a couple of images to me that together they really showcase the sort of contrast of what's at the very guts of the wellbeing economy idea. And this first one was a story that went viral on social media about a year ago. And you can see this chap in the cap. He met this lovely young chap, older chap, Rory, who was working at Walmart. And he really felt for Rory because Rory's the chap in the cap, and he met this chap here, Warren, who was still working at Walmart well into his 80s because he really couldn't afford his housing. He's a veteran and so on. And Rory, the guy in the cap, felt this was terrible. So he set up a GoFund campaign and did some TikTok and raised a ton of money and helped him pay off his house. And that's, I think, a lovely story, a beautiful bit of human compassion and charity. But it's about the same week that this image also came up on my social media, and I think it really gets to the guts of the contrast in what the wellbeing economy is about. And this is from Anil Dash, who's actually a tech guru from India, and he says these heartwarming stories of like the one I've just shared with you are usually temporary small-scale responses to systemic failures. And he says what we need to do is really tell the story of the structural changes to our unjust systems. So that's what I'm going to try and attempt today. But essentially, that is what the wellbeing economy is about, is going beyond these individual acts of charity, beautiful and important though they may be, but essentially to raise our gaze upstream to some of the root causes and those deeper drivers of why someone like Warren in the Walmart story was still working well into his 70s. You know, where's the questions around how much Walmart was paying, the nature of the housing system, benefits, and so on and so on. You'll all have your reasons. So let's dig into it. And essentially, to me, just to, I guess, really crudely summarize where we are today, I like to think of where we are today as what I describe as the long road option in our economic system. So you have, the first goal is get the economy to grow bigger, but very rarely do we hear attention being paid to the damage that this agenda does to people or to the environment. And then step two is sequester some money back through taxes, and you'll all be familiar with the machinations that go around that and the extent of tax evasion and avoidance. You only need to look at the Paradise Papers and the Panama Papers to get a sense of that. And then what we as societies like ours do with those taxes is use that to try to help people and planet cope with that first step. And the challenge is that this doesn't take account of things like, as we're seeing very, very acutely in Europe and North America at the moment, the extent to which we're basically pushing Mother Nature beyond her boundaries, and we're seeing the hemorrhaging of our planet with the extreme heat at the moment. But of course, it's not just climate change, it's all aspects of breaching planetary boundaries. When I first saw this photo, I thought it was a fake, I'll say, but it's actually just taken off the coast of Indonesia. And I use this to show that climate change and carbon emissions are only one aspect of the environmental crisis. We're, of course, looking at biodiversity loss and pollution and land use change and nitrogen cycles and so on. So we've got the environmental crisis that long road option that I just described doesn't take account of. But we've also got deep levels of injustice. And I think this cartoon sums this up so profoundly. And the more you look at it, you'll see more beautiful, beautiful details like the holes in the socks or the mildew on the walls and so on. And it really tells us that while we've got an economic system that is doing very, very well for some people, it's not delivering for enough people and planet. And yet when we talk about the economy, so often those fundamentals of what the economic system is about is things like gross domestic product, maybe look at that per capita. So of course we average out those inequalities inherent in that, fairly bland employment figures that don't look at the quality or the decency or let alone the purpose in that work. We're not looking enough at the impact on people. We can come back perhaps in the Q&A to the recent Measuring What Matters statement that is start of an attempt to get underneath the bonnet of some of those economic fundamentals. And then, though, what we have is what I'm increasingly describing as an economic fundamentalism, where you're seeing people and planet very much put as in service of the economic system, protecting and growing the economy being seen as the ultimate goal, and other social often goals seen as subservient to that, secondary to that. And so the choices that are made are very much to keep the economy growing in a very narrow sense of the word and protect the economy, as opposed to seeing the economy as delivering for higher order goals, which I'll come back to in a moment. And what we get, though, in response is, what I describe as essentially the crumbs of this agenda. So there's a couple of things I want to share with you. One is the extent to which we're servicing and spending great amounts of money on servicing the failure, individualisation in policy responses, and essentially holding up sticking plasters and seeing them as solutions. So this idea of failure demand derived actually from management literature. A chap called John Steddon coined the term, essentially saying that more demand for something is not necessarily a good thing. And it's come across to social policy, and of course ecological economists would talk about defensive expenditures, but essentially saying if we take a second glance at a lot of government spending, we can see that some of it is essentially costs that could have been avoided if we had a more socially just, more sustainable, more humane economic system. And the example in this photo here of the security system, I think, is quite a profound example of this. About 10 years ago, some Harvard economists estimated that in the US, about 5 million people were employed in what they called guard labour. So in security systems, defensive sectors, defensive industries, all those sorts of industries and jobs that are essentially created because we're scared of each other. And I looked up, tried to find out whether those statistics had been updated. And so there was some similar research from 2018 that said in some cities in the US, more people are employed in guard labour than are employed as teachers, which I think is a dire indictment of how society is progressing. And you only have to look at government announcements to see the extent of this failure demand, this responsive downstream after the fact efforts to heal and ameliorate the damage once it's been caused. Happy to go into that in more depth. And there's been some research that's underway from the University of Tasmania, the University of Glasgow, from the Centre for Policy Development, to try to put some figures on that. And the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, who Sharon mentioned earlier, have done some estimations for the jurisdictions of Scotland and Alberta. But loads of examples of this, and I guarantee you, once you start looking at news stories and government announcements, you will see examples of failure demand everywhere. The next one is essentially the step. So often we're turning the attention on individuals for what are to survive and cope, and putting the onus on individuals for what are ultimately bigger systemic problems that are beyond their control. And so we're seeing the individual as the unit of analysis where the onus of responsibility for change and for coping lies. And again, you'll get loads of examples of this, whether it's better labelling on food products, or here, treating mental health problems rather than looking upstream to see why, in this example here, little koala might be quite stressed in the face of the destruction of his habitat. And then finally, this idea of sticking plasters as solutions. And I want to give you an example that I saw a couple of years ago now in Wales, where I'd say quite a lovely creative initiative, where folks who were sleeping rough in this city of Wales were given stab-proof coats that could turn into sleeping bags, and so celebrated in newspapers like The Guardian. And of course, you can see why, because it's a very important, quite urgent, I'd say, humanitarian response. But ultimately, what are folks who are sleeping rough in Wales needing? They're needing safety and warmth and shelter. And so I think there's a risk of too many orientations around these band-aids or sticking plasters, as I had to say when I was living in Scotland, rather than just turning our attention to the real needs and the root causes of what's going wrong here. And so what can we imagine instead if we stop to say it's no longer good enough just to put sticking plasters over the collateral damage that the current system does to people and planet. It's not good enough just to keep spending money in that downstream failure demand. And if it's not good enough just to put all the onus of responsibility on individuals, how can we start to look upstream and turn our attention to the economic system and imagine an economic system that delivers for people and planet? And the simplest way I can describe the goal of a wellbeing economy is really very deliberately shaping our economic system so that it delivers social justice on a healthy planet. I want to just very briefly pause on the term well-being because it's a term that's quite broad and ubiquitous, but also has a whole lot of different connotations and different meanings for people, all sorts of different understandings. And there's an ad that you can find on YouTube. It's an ad for Audi cars, and it depicts this really dystopian scene. And I was struck by it because about 10 years ago, I wrote a blog saying that too much focus on individual subjective well-being was like turning up the volumes on your headphones while a riot raged around you. And then I saw this ad from Audi, and I think it's still on YouTube, so you can go and watch it. And it really describes what I was talking about then. So you have this horrible sort of fighting happening in this city, people getting damaged, bashed and hurt. And one of the characters escapes into a car, an Audi car, and miraculously he has a glass of champagne handed to him. And then his feet warmers come on and the song Easy Like Sunday Morning starts playing. But you can see outside the window, the fighting, the fires are burning outside the window, all sorts of damage. And yet the implication in this ad is that this chap's subjective well-being would have been quite high, and yet a riot quite literally raging around him. And so I make this point to say that the wellbeing economy is very, very deliberately and unashamedly looking at that wider context. It's not good enough just to have individuals reporting in the case that they're lucky enough to find an Audi that gives him champagne and puts his feet warmers on. We need to look at the context and the circumstances in which fellow human beings and our planet are situated. So it's very much a collective, multi-dimensional understanding of well-being that I'm using here when I talk about the wellbeing economy. I also think of the term wellbeing economy as a little bit like a picnic blanket. So you've probably all come across different terms of all sorts of incredible visions and ideas that speak to a different way of understanding the economic system. So whether that's buen vivir from Latin America, or regenerative economics, or donut economics from Kate Raworth and her colleagues, or steady state economy and so on, feminist economics, I don't see the wellbeing economy as a synonym for any of these, and I certainly don't see it as a competitor term. We see the wellbeing economy as a little bit like a picnic blanket that's welcoming all of these different terms that have their different emphasis and will resonate very much in different contexts, but very much at their core have some common themes. So I want to draw that out, excuse me. And in a way, I think one of the key commonalities across these various ideas that the wellbeing economy agenda really puts at the fore is moving from this idea, any of you who are alive in the early 90s will remember this idea of sustainable development being a bit like these three pillars, where you have on a par the economy, the environment, and society. And I actually think this is one of the most dangerous images there is, because it really gives the economy equal footing, equal billing to things like the environment and our social systems. And so inherently what the wellbeing economy agenda is about is really bringing to the fore the mindset that, of course, feminist economists have been saying for decades, ecological economists have been saying for decades, and what First Nations communities around the world have been living for millennia. And that is that we need to understand the reality of the economy being as a subset of society, and the two as a subset within our precious natural living home. So that's one of the key aspects of the wellbeing economy approach. And it's quite easy, I guess, to say on a webinar like this, but it's quite a fundamental reorientation when it comes to perhaps political decision making. We can come back to that a little bit more. So if we're going to get practical, how do we go about building a wellbeing economy? What are some of the pieces? So speaking of pieces, you have to get your head around all the different levels that are going to need to see change. And this is a depiction of as a framework that many of you will probably know from Frank Gill's the multi-level system perspective, that essentially to bring about this sort of economic system change, we need change at all levels of this system, from the grassroots pioneering activities, the micro level that you see there, to the rules, the policy instruments, the tax systems, the incentive systems that you'd have at the policy regime, and then also the landscape level too, the environment, technology, but also how we almost think about the economic system, the questions we're even allowed to ask about our economy and its purpose. Does development have a destination? Can growth have run its course, for example, the sort of things that we tackle in the book that Sharon has mentioned. So hold those three levels in your mind. But then also I want to bring in, so I've got picnic blanket, I want to bring in another metaphor, and this is the jigsaw puzzle, because I suspect a lot of you will already be thinking, well, to bring about this sort of economic system change, we need a whole plethora of shifts at all those different levels, whether that's how we generate energy, how we design buildings, different business models, production and consumption systems, tax systems, supranational agencies, all those sorts of things. And so I think of it as a bit like a 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle. The good news is that there are people working on different component parts of that jigsaw puzzle in all corners of the world, starting to document what it looks like, starting to experiment, starting to model the changes that we see. But how I get my head around the idea of this 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle, how I make sense of it in my mind, is by thinking about what you do with any jigsaw puzzle that you're starting, is that you start with the corners. So I want to offer you the 4 corners of the wellbeing economy in practice. And these rather conveniently all start with P. So they are purpose, prevention, pre-distribution, and people-powered. Just see. So purpose is essentially this question of, are we able to see the idea of the economy as a means or an ends in itself? Are we going to get our head around, say, when it comes to economic growth, asking the questions, what sort of growth do we need? I often say that instead of being ever faithful followers of economic growth, we need to be its fair weather friends. So we need to ask questions around the direction and the composition of economic growth, rather than just narrowly focusing on the rate of quarterly increases of GDP that you'd see every couple of months. So we need to say, what is it we need more of in our economy, and what do we need to power down, if we're honest. And the sort of practical pieces of the jigsaw puzzle you'd see here are things like multidimensional wellbeing frameworks that's just been released by the federal government. Lots of governments around the world have these, but also things like for-purpose business models, but also rethinking what's the value of different professions and different social activities in society. And I think one of the better aspects of COVID was that we saw a reappraisal of which jobs most make a difference and keep societies going. All sorts of other things as well in that corner. The next one, bear with me. The next one is prevention. And this is essentially going back to what I was saying earlier, saying that we have to do better than just helping people survive and cope with today and tomorrow. We need to really take the time to ask why and why and why, and to really look upstream until we find ourselves facing the root causes and taking action there. And so to give you an example of the sort of things you'd expect to see in the prevention corner of the jigsaw puzzle. So the more jobs pay enough and offer dignity and a sense of purpose for people, the less you'll need governments, say, to spend on rent assistance or top-up wages, or less you'll need GPs prescribing anti-anxiety drugs. The more circular our production and consumption systems, the less beach cleanups you'll need. The more renewable our energy systems are, the less carbon capture, sequestration and storage we'll be having to spend money on, let alone the responses after climate change induced emergencies. And you all probably have some examples of sort of things you'd see in that corner. The third one, pre-distribution, is admittedly a bit of a clunky term, but I think it's an incredibly exciting concept. And it's essentially saying, yes, there is a place for redistribution. This is where government steps in after the fact and through taxes and transfers, sort of slightly reduces the gap between rich and poor in an economic sense in a society. In Australia, the government's intervention reduces economic inequality by about 1/3, which to me feels like quite a heavy lift. And as I mentioned earlier, there's all sorts of machinations around that in the past. There's been a lot of horrible stigma around welfare changes or welfare payments, but also, as we've seen in things like the Paradise Papers and the Panama Papers, a real readiness for certain folks to tax evade and avoid. Pre-distribution says, okay, let's get things right first time around. Let's get the economy to do more of the heavy lifting. So this is designing market outcomes so they generate more equal outcomes in the first place. So things like worker cooperatives where you have labour owning the capital, things like community wealth building where you're generating economic activities from the community up rather than sitting back and waiting for trickle down to happen. But also things like true cost accounting, where you're seeing the real cost in an environmental sense or in a social sense embedded in goods and services so that we're not facing these misleadingly cheap prices for our goods and services. Again, lots of other examples there that many of you might have examples of or be involved in. And then the final piece, people powered. This is essentially saying we need to have folks who are, one, going to be most affected by this, but also have people feel in control of these changes. And there's all sorts of incredible innovations in terms of really involving folks in questions around economic change, whether that's participatory budgeting that you can see from Porto Alegre to Porto to New York, whether that's citizens' assemblies, famously Ireland, but also in the UK around climate change and climate action, really showing that when folks have this chance to sit and reflect and learn from each other, they're up for really bold actions. Again, economic democracy, again, having sort of wider suite of stakeholders around the boardroom decision making. So again, a lot of German examples are famous for that, or as I said earlier, so worker co-ops or community interest companies. So really broadening out who feels they have a tangible say in the economic system. The role of government is a really important one, but not the only point. But of course, government has a huge role in really shaping the rules of the game. I just want to share with you, to me, a really important sequence. So if you start in the top right-hand corner of this slide, so ultimately, our ultimate objective is a world where people can flourish, where our environment's healthy. So essentially, social justice on a healthy planet. The wellbeing economy is about underpinning that. So even the wellbeing economy is not the goal in its own right. To build a wellbeing economy, we need wellbeing in government. We need governments to be really focusing on how they can design the rules of the game to help shape and encourage and nurture that sort of economic system. So that will mean powering down certain activities, and it will mean nurturing and encouraging others. And so that requires us, really reshaping what are the goals of government, how does government take decisions, what are the timeframes that government has in mind, how do different government departments work together, how do they evaluate success, what do they see as the sort of activities they want to support, and how can they utilise through various instruments to perhaps reduce the sort of activities that are not aligned with our ultimate goal. And there are examples of these from all over the world. So you've probably heard, because she was visiting Australia back in April, of Sophie Howe, who's the outgoing Future Generations Commissioner in Wales. They have a Future Generations Act, and basically it says to all 46 Welsh public agencies that they need to align their activities with the wellbeing of current and future generations, and they've got 6 or so goals. Happy to talk about that a little bit more. But you have countries like Sweden who are saying, well, we want to encourage more repair and more circular economies, so we're going to use things like the tax system to make it cheaper and more affordable for folks to repair their goods rather than just throwing them all away, as I was told to do so recently when my printer that I got on Buy Nothing Group broke, and I was told by everyone I phoned to just throw it away and buy a new one, which of course is terrible for the environment. You see places like France saying if you can get somewhere in less than 2.5 hours, you don't need to fly. So we're going to ban short-haul flights if you can get somewhere on a train in that sort of distance. You see places like Italy that for a long time have been really encouraging worker cooperatives, to the extent that places like Bologna, in Emilia-Romagna in the north of Italy, about a third of that local GDP is made up of worker cooperatives. And they have higher levels of gender equality and all sorts of really positive aspects. Even in one study, finding that a town that had a high percentage of co-ops had higher levels of voting, higher levels of education, and even higher levels of blood donation compared to the nearby town that didn't have such high levels of worker co-ops. So for a long time, Italy has had structures to really support these sorts of pro-social business models that I think are a really important part of the economic ecosystem that we need to see in a wellbeing economy. And then places like Israel, but also in Oregon, are saying we don't want to have these extreme levels of earnings inequality within firms. So we're going to crack down in terms of taxes on firms that are paying their CEOs, in this case, more than 35 times their lowest paid salaries. And there is a whole plethora of other changes. What's interesting that other than the case of Wales, none of these have the word wellbeing in the title. The key thing is are they starting to reorientate the economic system so that it's much better for people and planet? That's how you know, not through a simple word search of the term wellbeing in government legislation. But of course, enterprises have a huge role to play in this. And I want to share with you this, I think, quite beautiful definition of the purpose of business that comes from the British Academy, and saying their purpose of business is to solve the problems of people and planet profitably, so profitably being a second order goal there, but not to profit from causing those problems. And I suspect you'll probably all be able to think of examples of businesses that do the latter, but also businesses that are part of the former. And as I said, that's come from the British Academy. So let's look at a couple of examples of that, just to give you a sense of, again, the sort of businesses we want to see more of in a wellbeing economy. This is one just outside Glasgow. Sharon, I don't know if you've been there, but it's a great little place where Mark here, I think, gets up every morning trying to make his business, his brewery, more circular. So he's working out how to capture the carbon. His tap room is made of old pallets. Instead of linking his beer cans together through those plastic rings, he's using something that's made out of prawn shells, and he even has a line of beer that's made from old toast, old bread that a nearby bakery would have thrown away. This is another of my favourite ones from Glasgow, where I used to live, Green City Whole Foods, and it's a worker cooperative, and they've been around since the 70s. So they're doing something very right. They're financially definitely viable, but they're working very hard also to reduce their supply chain, and to really, their mission is to take care of their members rather than just to make a lot of profits that then go up to remote shareholders. This is a place in Sydney. If anyone has been here, I'd love to hear about it, because I've tried a couple of times and not quite made it to visit. But this is a restaurant called ReE, and they say that everything you touch would have gone to landfill. So these rather funky bars that you can see and tables that you can see there came from discarded Tupperware, and even their food and the booze that they make their rather beautiful looking cocktails out of would have been thrown away, or was going to be thrown away by other restaurants. And so they collect it and repurpose it into rather fantastic looking food. But of course, it's not just these smaller individual examples. There are big enterprises who are getting their head around this. So this Dutch bank, Triodos Bank, it's a B corporation, and they very much see their mission as to invest in the sort of activities that the future needs, particularly sustainable or community-owned initiatives. There's this Edinburgh-based company called Faith in Nature, who has just recently appointed someone to their board of directors whose job it is to represent the interests of nature. So you have, when the board's sitting around making its decisions, someone there who is fighting the corner of the natural world. Even companies like Microsoft are making these, I think, incredibly bold pledges, and let's see how they go in delivering it, but to go completely carbon negative, so to take out all the carbon that they have emitted since they were founded in 1975, so much older than net zero. And then even companies like Unilever, and again, let's watch them. This doesn't make them perfect. I'm not carrying a flag for them by any means, but I think these sorts of efforts, to the extent that they're properly delivered, give us an example of the sort of behaviours that we need more of. So Unilever here saying it wants to make sure living wages are paid across its entire supply chain. And then some of you might know of the sort of quite well-known in Scandinavian initiative of having these foundation companies, where you have a foundation or a trust owning a majority of shares. And so their business is about channeling money to these foundations to deliver charitable purposes. And this is one of the biggest companies in Scandinavia, NovoNordisk, whose mission it is to rid the world of diabetes. And these are just the sort of examples of, I think, business activities, none of them perfect on their own or sufficient on their own, but the sort of things we need to see more of in a wellbeing economy. I want to finish by sharing with you a couple of, I guess, hopeful signs, because sometimes it is quite hard to stay hopeful given some of the treacheries and things we're seeing around the world and here here in Australia. But just to finish off by giving you a sense of what I'm seeing that I guess keeps me optimistic that maybe change is possible. One is the extent to which opinion polls and perhaps more importantly, deliberative democracy exercises are showing that people are not greedy. They're not saying we just want carte blanche economic growth, that are really saying we want the economy to address their needs, to address climate change, and to deliver much better levels of economic and horizontal inequalities as well. But also we're seeing certain people in government really recognising that business as usual is not good enough. And just in the last few months, we've had a huge conference around the Wellbeing Economy hosted by the Icelandic government. They've just committed to having one of these every year for the next 5 years. And at the European Parliament in May, a huge Beyond Growth conference, sitting in the heart of the European Parliament, addressed by Ursula von der Leyen, really grappling with some of these questions around how do we design an economy that's better than dependent on economic growth. We're also seeing, I think, the debate moving, I hope, beyond statistics. And this is a question for Australia, whether Australia has moved beyond statistics. Again, happy to come back to that. It's much more about making those measures matter. How do we utilise the knowledge that the statistics give us, but not saying lack of statistics is an excuse? How do we put them into practice in terms of policy making? And as I said, we're seeing plenty of businesses showing that the private sector has the potential to be part of positive change. We're seeing in cities and communities around the world things like donut economics models and community wealth building. And again, happy to talk a bit more about what that means in practice, but really showing here's what it starts to look like in practice. And we're seeing certain funders, by no means enough, but start to grapple with that they need to do more than just fund those band-aids, those sticking plasters, that downstream response. Yes, that's important, and I don't want to denigrate that. It's absolutely vital humanitarian response to an inhumane system. But we're getting funders and others starting to say we have to raise our gaze and look upstream to a better economic system. I'll stop there, Sharon. It wasn't as short as I hoped. Thank you.
Katherine, I mean, we are so lucky to have heard from you. That is just outstanding. Thank you, thank you, thank you. So if, I don't know if people can see, but yes, we can do. Marvellous. So we're just going to, before we open up, and I saw there's questions coming through and hands it up, but Megan is just going to give just a few minutes of a reflection sort of from the Hothouse. And then I promise we'll open up for discussion with Katherine. Marvellous. So let me stop sharing. So Megan, over to you.
Great, thank you, Sharon. And thank you so much, Katherine. I mean, you know, as Sharon said, I want to echo, it's such a privilege to have you with us and to hear you speak about these things. So I just want to offer some reflections about kind of opportunities and questions and challenges that remain in relation to some of the things that we think about here in the Planetary Health Equity Hothouse. The first, I'll offer about 4 points. And the first is around coherence. And so this really focuses on the role of government, but also kind of governance, including actors beyond the state as well. And there really does seem to be potential with these well-being frameworks and kind of economy approaches to promote synergies and coherence across domains of policy and social goods and social needs that governments respond to. You know, as Katherine said, to promote social justice through prevention and predistribution. And partly this is through reorienting the kind of policy and governance focus on economic measures towards social justice, away from that economic fundamentalism as you framed it. But I think one of the big issues within coherence that we talk about within that literature and in relation to policy practice and the potential for coherence is the issue of trade-offs and how to navigate trade-offs between policy domains, between different goals of governments. So this does kind of, you know, get down to, I guess, the level of implementation below the vision of a well-being economy. And so I think, you know, there's an opportunity in terms of those trade-offs in balancing well-being measures with economic ones and balancing a focus on well-being kind of alongside economic issues. And with respect to, I think, the dominance of cost effectiveness as a policy decision-making tool, so introducing other measures, and I know I'm focusing on the kind of measures and statistics aspect of things, but we do know that, that does drive policymaking. That is something that's important. So maybe there's, a need for a kind of governance cultural shift in there as well. But yeah, I think there's potential for the well-being frameworks to drive, to provide a kind of pathway, a mechanism, to provide specific tools to navigate these trade-offs within, the goals of achieving coherence. And partly this may be through making kind of those trade-offs more explicit. So through making, priority setting and decision-making more explicit. And in relation to that, I think there's, one of the things I'm interested in with respect to well-being economies is in terms of the nitty-gritty of the practice of their use in policymaking is kind of the use of indexes versus individual measures. How does that sort of, very practice-based aspect of this shape priority setting, decision-making, the potential for holism versus siloed approaches in achieving coherence. I think another aspect that I think is really interesting and another area of opportunity really with well-being frameworks and economies is in the potential to promote collaborative and deliberative governance or people-powered governance, as you said, Katherine, and that promotion of kind of citizen-led priority setting. And, I think with respect to, globally, I think that's a question of interest to me. But with respect to Australia in particular, if you have reflections about that with kind of the process that's happened around measuring what matters, and that would be great to hear about that. And I think, so there's real potential there. There's also questions, of course, like any policy or government or governance tool, how do we ensure that it promotes the public interest in that kind of, citizen-led or kind of deliberative process? How do we protect against conflicts of interest? How do we ensure that the interests and the ideas that gain currency, that gain power within these processes are in the public interest? And this is, I think, always a question and an issue in terms of procedural justice and equity within governance questions for social goods that we're interested in. So yeah, I think I'll just wrap up with kind of quite a big picture question as well. So really going from the very practical to the big picture. And, obviously there's tremendous potential for well-being economies in promoting equity and promoting planetary health equity, which is what we're working on in the Hothouse. And I just wonder, so I think the way that I understand a lot of that potential is in terms of distributive equity within jurisdictions. And I just wonder about the implications across jurisdictions, or for example, across countries. So from a multi-level perspective, as you presented, I think one opportunity that I can think of is the opportunity to spread these norms. So the diffusion of norms, kind of undermining or transforming away from the economic fundamentalism. So there is that potential in a global sense. But in terms of global justice and justice between contexts, yeah, I wonder what the well-being economy brings to that, which is, I think, maybe an enormous question. And I don't expect you to answer that, Katherine, but I think it's something that I'm interested in as we study, these frameworks and this model and this vision going forward. So I think I'll stop there and just thank you again. And I look forward to all the questions and discussion with everyone online.
Lovely, thanks, Megan. So we might let you sort of reflect on that, and then I'm going to come to you, Chelsea. You've had your hand, you've been waiting patiently.
And I'll try and be really quick, and I'm going to do so try and be quick reluctantly, because Megan, there's such good questions, and I'd love to really dive in really properly. But for the sake of getting to other discussions, and we can keep carrying on the conversations. I mean, I know I probably won't cover all of them. I mean, the question of indices and indexes in policy making, I come at this, and others will have different views, of course. I come at this from a pretty tactical, pragmatic approach, that if we can have something that shines a spotlight on a broader suite of issues and makes government look upstream a little bit more, then that's powerful. And so about 15 years or so ago, I was involved in creating something in Scotland called the Humankind Index, and it was a really rough and ready project, tiny budget, lots and lots of rough edges, but it was very, very deliberative by definition in its creation, and it was very much about saying, how can we get the voices, particularly of the most seldom heard folks, people who are really most disenfranchised in the current way of doing policy making? How can we put their voices to the fore of what most matters to them? And in hindsight, it was actually quite powerful in shifting the debate in Scotland, because it sparked a refresh of the national performance framework. And now we've got a position, at least where the Scottish government, I mean, rhetorically we can debate how good the Scottish government is in actual fact, but they now have a cabinet secretary for the Wellbeing Economy. They have a stated objective of building a Wellbeing Economy. They're one of the founders of the Wellbeing Economy Governments Partnership. They're doing all sorts of other pieces around economic justice, around community ownership, around circular economy. Not perfect by any means, and I could speak for probably 3 days on the flaws of what's happening in Scotland, but it has pushed that debate along. And so the idea of an index to shine a light and push conversations and to broaden up the debate around what's the economy for, is it working for enough people, what are the problems with the way the economy is operating, I think it's really important. And to give you another brief example, when I used to work for Oxfam, I had colleagues in Brazil who said to me that when the UN did state level initiative measurements of the Human Development Index, so different Brazilian states, that really galvanized the political leaders of respective Brazilian states to take action on where they were falling short. So seems like politicians love a league table, and we could probably concede that that's not the sort of competition and beggar thy neighbour attitude that actually is conducive to a better economic system. But while they are still there, seeing where they're sitting in league tables, so for example, it's out in the news today that Australia has improved its ranking on gender justice league tables, then that, these are important things that can galvanise political action. And in terms of deliberative governance, I mean, I'm a big fan of deliberative democracy, and the more we can augment the rather thin aspect of democracy that is voting every couple of years with more participatory mechanisms, I think the better. And I was really fortunate enough to be part of a couple of citizens' assemblies in Scotland around the future of Scotland, and around also how Scotland would move towards more climate justice and the just transition around meeting its obligations under the Paris Agreement. And what was beautiful there, and yeah, they're flawed too. So none of these are perfect on their own. And anyone, as you know, who's offering something as a perfect solution, I think you should be very wary with. But like I said, it's a jigsaw puzzle. But my experience of those citizens' assemblies is, one, when folks have a chance to have experts on tap and to reflect together and learn from each other and take the time to think, what is it we really want here, and not just give a very brief answer, say, to an opinion poll, but really discuss. They come up with incredibly bold policy suggestions. And for example, the UK one, it's really pushing around reduction of consumption of red meat, a frequent flyer levy, much bolder climate targets, which incidentally the UK government is currently pulling back on. The test, of course, is then how much are they utilised by government. And in Scotland, it's quite a cool Scottish story that the Scottish Citizens Climate Assembly took its report to the Scottish Government. Scottish Government then responded to it, and the members of that Citizens Assembly decided to meet again. This is during COVID, so it was 2 days of Zoom after having had several weekends together in the previous year. They opted to meet again to go through the Scottish Government's response and then say to the Scottish Government, this is not good enough. You are not taking the urgency of change seriously. And apparently that's the first time in the world that's happened. And I think these are lessons that Australia needs to heed when we're talking about measuring what matters. You remember that arrow I showed? I think that showed, to me, that arrow is important because it shows that by rushing to a measuring what matters statement, there's a risk that the important national conversation isn't underpinning it. I don't think it's too late, and there are pretty obvious reasons why Australia can't do a national conversation this year of all years. But I do think it's really important that the measures and then they have a democratic mandate so that they outlast, political changes, but also that folks see themselves in those measures and then hold their politicians to account for them. So that the need for a national conversation is really important. And then finally, to your point on sort of the issue of sort of equity across jurisdictions, but to be honest, the reason I got into this space is when I was working at Oxfam, an organisation very much about global justice. And I just became increasingly, I felt quite acutely and was feeling this quite powerfully physically, that if Oxfam, and as someone working for Oxfam, if we really cared about global justice, we had to look at the economic models of the global north, because they are quite literally taking more of their fair share of ecological space. And so until we address that, we're implicitly saying that global inequalities are here to stay. And so that's why I focused on the belly of the beast, of economic models like Australia's, like UK's, Canada's, France, Germany's, US, so that they're the ones that most urgently need to transform their economic systems, because they're the ones that are pushing the planet beyond what she can handle. And of course, it's not everyone in there. There's a lot of poverty and inequality within those countries, of course. But also, on the flip side, there is no GDP correlation for good ideas. I mentioned briefly Buen Vivir, but there's lots of other incredible examples of how to do things differently, how to have a different priority in terms of economic policy making that you get from around the world. And so again, it has, it's got to be a two-way thing in terms of, you were talking about sharing of norms and different ideas. I think there's inspiration from everywhere. Happy to dig into that more too.
Yeah, well, and we've got time afterwards, so we can